Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We continue our discussion on deadlocks in this lecture and see how deadlock avoidance algorithm works. We will continue our discussion in this lecture from methods for handling deadlock and deadlock avoidance method will be continued here. Let's now come to deadlock avoidance algorithm. It is also known as Banker's algorithm. This algorithm works for the multiple instances of resources. It is required for every process to declare maximum number of resources it would require in advance. When a request is submitted by a process, if resource cannot be immediately assigned, so process may have to wait. When process gets all its required resources, so the process must return all of them after utilization in a predefined time. Here is the example of Banker's algorithm. Keep in mind that Banker's algorithm works for the multiple instances of the resource. So for example, there is a resource in the system having 12 instances and 3 processes are there, P1, P2 and P3. All of these processes have in advance declared their maximum demands. P1 would require 10 instances of the resource, P2 would require 4 instances, and P3 would require 9 instances of the resource. If we add all these demands, so that would be more than the available number of instances. The available number of instances is 12 for the resource, while the total demand of 3 processes make 23. So practically, the demands are unable to be fulfilled at once. So every process will be assigned few instances at the beginning and rest will be assigned when they are available. Let's suppose initially P1 is assigned 5 instances, P2 is assigned 2 instances, and P3 is also assigned 2 instances of the resource. This information can be seen in the table above. So the highlighted table would give you these assignment information. Now let's see how operating system ensures a safe sequence and when the sequence goes unsafe. As you can see in the table as highlighted, the remaining needs are mentioned after initial assignments to processes. And the remaining instances of the resources is also mentioned. System have 3 available instances of the resources which can still be distributed among processes. So, if process P1 is further given 1 resource, its remaining request would reduce to 4. See the first assignment sequence. The one I highlighted. So if one resource is assigned to process P1, its remaining resource request would reduce to 4 and remaining instances of resource will also reduce to 2. If these two remaining instances of resource are assigned to process P2, whose remaining demand is also of 2 instances, so all the demands of P2 would go to complete, but the system will be left with 0 instances of the resource. P2 would complete its execution, utilize the resource, and would release 4 instances of the resource. These 4 instances would then be assigned to P1, whose demand also go to complete, and after utilization, it would release 10 instances of the resource. From these 10 instances, the demand of P3 can be completed, who require 7 more instances of the resource, and hence the system stays in safe sequence. But on the contrary, if you see the table below, let me highlight it. The distribution is in the form given in this highlighted table. P3 has been assigned one resource whose demand reduces to 6, and system has 2 further available resources. If all the 2 remaining resources are assigned to P2, whose demand goes to complete, and after utilization, it would release 4 resources. But 4 resources are not enough to complete demands of neither P1, who requires further 5 instances, nor P3, who further requires 6 instances. Hence, the system goes in unsafe state, and it may enter in deadlock. So the resources are assigned in such a manner that the system remains in safe state. Deadlock detection works to look for circular weight in the resource allocation graph. After detection of deadlock, we would look for the schemes to recover from deadlock. For the single instance of resources in the resource allocation graph, we would try to reduce it to wait for graph. The corresponding wait for graph is developed from resource allocation graph by eliminating resources and connecting processes, such as process Pi is waiting for a resource held by process Pj. So an edge from Pi to Pj will be drawn. Then circles in the wait for graph will be detected to check if the system is in deadlock or live lock. This is how we convert resource allocation graph to corresponding wait for graph. As you can see, we have only eliminated the resources from the resource allocation graph and connected the processes with each other. So the graph has become shorter and easy to locate the circles in it. You can see there are 2 circles in the corresponding wait for graph, one from process P1, P2, P3, P4 and back to P1. Let me highlight this. So, first circle involving 4 processes, and another circle is between P1, P2, P4 and back to P1. Let me highlight it also. So these are the 2 circles which you can easily draw. How deadlock detection works? For a single instance of resources, we would draw the corresponding wait for graph. And for the multiple instances of resources, we would use the same Banker's algorithm as we have discussed in the previous slides. Last topic of discussion in this chapter, as mentioned in the outline, is recovery from the deadlock. So let's see how we can recover if we ever stuck in deadlock. Now we will talk on how a system can be recovered if it ever stuck in deadlock. We have 2 techniques. First is by process termination. Operating system can terminate or abort all processes stuck in deadlock, or it can abort one process at a time until the deadlock gets finished. Now the question is, if many processes are stuck in deadlock, so which process must be first terminated? So the selection of process as victim can be done by different ways, such as operating system can check the priority of the processes. A higher priority process will not be terminated first. Instead, a low priority process will be first selected as a victim to get terminated. Second criteria for selection of a victim may be on the basis of CPU use. How much time a process has spent on CPU and how much more time it would require on CPU. If it has spent more time on CPU and requires less time more on CPU, so terminating such a process may be expensive. Another criteria may be on the basis of the resources used by the process and how much more resources it would require further to complete their execution. If a process has used less number of resources and requires a lot of more resources to complete its execution, so terminating it would be less harmful as compared to the one who has used a lot of resources and requires less number of resources further to complete its execution. Then operating system may decide upon if the process is interactive or batch. Terminating an interactive process may be expensive as compared to the batch process, as process when comes again would again require interaction from the user, while batch process does not require any interaction. Operating system may have to decide how many processes will get terminated to come out of the deadlock. So these are some of the criteria for selecting a victim process that may get terminated in order to recover the system from deadlock. Since for recovery from the deadlock, operating system has to terminate few processes. That means all their held resources will be preempted. So another mechanism to recover from deadlock is the resource preemption. We have already discussed first mechanism in the previous slide, that was process termination, and this is another mechanism, that is resource termination. So the victim selection is made on the criteria as we have already discussed in the previous slide. The victim is selected that would be less expensive for the operating system. The terminated process will be rolled back to some safe state and would restart all its operations. It is important to keep in mind the starvation factor while selecting a victim process. A process, if always is selected as a victim and gets terminated always, would result in its starvation. Since the terminated process may never get a chance to complete its execution. So this is an issue while selecting a victim process. This factor is kept in mind while selecting a victim process that needs to be terminated in order to recover from deadlock. That is all. Here we come to an end of this chapter. I hope you have understood all the concepts related to deadlock very well. I thank you all.